Hi guys, good morning. Welcome to our fourth and final session of the DevOps 101 course for Salesforce admin. We're just gonna give a couple of seconds, couple of minutes for people to roll in and we'll get started. All right, I think we can get started with our fourth and final session of DevOps 101. We're going to be covering CI/CD, version control, and testing today. A few housekeeping messages. You will be muted, but if you have any questions, feel free to raise your hand and I'll be happy to unmute you and let you ask whatever you want to ask. If you'd rather not be broadcasted, just ask your questions in the Q&A box and we'll be happy to answer them. And lastly, this will be recorded and you'll be given a recording tomorrow, not the 4th of April, but tomorrow. I am Shannon Werland. I'm the demand generation coordinator here, and today Derek Black will walk you through our topics, our director of customer experience. And without further ado, I'll let him take it.
Yeah, sure. Welcome everyone. Thanks for coming back. Joining us again today. This is our last course in the DevOps 101 sessions. Today we'll be talking about CI/CD, which is continuous integration, continuous deployment. Sometimes people call this continuous delivery as well. Most people just call it CI/CD and don't really have an idea of what they mean when they're talking about. So hopefully I can explain what all of CI/CD is, what that looks like at a best-in-class environment. And we'll also talk about testing and version control because these are some important pieces that tie very closely into CI/CD. So we'll cover what best-in-class looks like for those as well on Salesforce. If you missed our prior sessions on governance, release management, and environment strategy, I believe that you can find recordings of those on our website, prodly.co. So you can go there and check out what we have. I think probably in our resources, there's webinar recordings. Shannon, is that right? Did I put you on the spot?
Yes, everybody that has attended and has not attended will get a email with a link to all the sessions neatly together in one place.
Okay, cool. So CI/CD, what does that mean? It's not necessarily one thing. Of course, there's the continuous integration piece and the continuous deployment. Continuous integration is really important because it keeps all of your in-flight work in sync across various developer environments that people may be using. So the idea is that if you have, 5 or 6 people working on Salesforce, they each have their own environments, which we talked about in the environment strategy course. CI is the process and practice of keeping everyone up to date with what's going on. So this helps avoid conflicts and reduces bugs by giving everyone the most up-to-date framework of what's going on in Salesforce. So if someone's making new fields and process builders and validations and things like that in one org, and they finish it and they love it and they think it's good, you can send that to people that are doing work in other development environments that are maybe not connected, or maybe they're working on different things. So it can help you eliminate that conversation of this worked in my dev org, but it doesn't work in UAT and I don't know why. It doesn't make sense to me. This will make this, evident to people because they'll have the latest and greatest things that are in UAT or your integration environments while they're doing their work, which is really important. The continuous deployment or continuous delivery piece of this, it's really important because it reduces risk of bugs landing in production. If you're doing the CD part correctly, you are using a staging environment and you are finding any potential problems of that actual delivery to production before that happens. This can also help improve release velocity. So if you're doing CI and CD together, as soon as things are approved, checked off that they passed all testing, they can quickly make their way to production, and they don't necessarily have to wait on a backlog of other functions to end up reaching your end users. And this can make end users happy because the things that they're asking for from your team are arriving a lot faster. So, just the other day here at Prodly, I had some type of issues with some page layouts, and those were quickly delivered because we follow a lot of these best practices. So to kind of start immediately talking about what this looks like when you are also connected to a version control system, this slide is an example of what CI/CD looks like when you're using version control, which is really kind of the best in class for software development. You may or may not have the ability to connect to version control with Salesforce. It's not a a must-have really, but it is nice for people that have a really developer-centric Salesforce team. They're going to be used to having something like this in place. So the concept here is that you have a version control system kind of at the bottom that goes across everything. That's your source of truth for everything that's going on inside of production, basically. So you'll back up production to your version control system. That will work as effectively what's called your master branch. So you have a copy of production that kind of fuels and starts all of your work. Your dev and scratch orgs at the very bottom end here on the left, they will pick up a copy of that production data, or maybe sometimes a subset of it if they don't need everything for the work that they're doing. Make their changes and commit back to the version control system in a branch. So every one of these dev and scratch orgs will have their own branch, and a branch is basically the corresponding changes and differences that are happening in relationship to the master branch. So if I went into a dev org and I added 10 fields and 3 flows and made some new permissions and profiles, those changes will be picked up in that dev branch. Then the way this kind of progresses is those changes are then merged into an integration org, or maybe you're calling this UAT. Ideally, you might have more kind of steps than are shown in this slide. This is just kind of simplified because we don't want to have a million boxes on here. I have another slide later that's a bit closer to what you would find in best in class organization. But as those changes are coming in from all these different dev branches, they can be picked up and pushed into an integration org. And that's where you'll validate that, hey, these things work together. We can promote those forward, and you'll push those to staging after they've passed some testing. And then staging is where you effectively test your deployment. And again, everything funnels through the version control system. So I'm picking up the changes in staging from the repository. I'm sending them back to the repository after I approve them, and then from the repository, they end up in production finally. So this leads us to one of our first poll questions of the day. I think we have 3 or 4 of them. Are you currently connected to a version control system for Salesforce? Something like GitHub, Bitbucket, Azure. GitLab is kind of popular these days as well. So far, it looks like 1 person has responded and they are connected. All right. 3 people have got back and some of you are connected. Give it maybe another 20 seconds to wait for a couple other people to maybe respond.
All right, seeing a pretty even, sort of even distribution here. I'm gonna close the poll.
All right, so half of our audience is connected. That's good to hear. And if you are connected to a repo, this is a bit more in detailed process of how this all works. So I have a developer or an admin that is doing all their work in a dev or a scratch org. The dev or scratch org is set up from the project repository, which is maybe something that is owned directly by this developer. It's all of their changes or their team or something like that. And they'll push and test their own changes and keep updating and keeping a record of what they're doing just in their project repository. So this isn't necessarily a finalized product, but it's going to kind of keep track and have a running log of all the changes as they compare to the master branch. When they're finally happy with what they have done, they will then push their changes from their own project repository into a production repository, or basically something that is more related to what production looks like. From here, these changes will then be pushed into like a QA integration or UAT org, something like that, to validate that they work and they work with whatever else is going on. So we don't have just this one developer over here. We might have 2 or 100 or however many people are working in your Salesforce environment. The production repository in this first step in this process is going to pick up and merge the changes and make sure that they work. After everything has been kind of decided that it works together really well, it's back to the production repository and then to a staging org, which is maybe after a bounce to UAT to make sure that your users like it. The staging org is going to verify that your package deployment doesn't break anything in production when it lands there. So that's really important. After that has been confirmed, we'll kick back to the repository, and then from the repo, we'll push those changes to prod. So kind of just another overview of what I talked about in the previous slide. This is how that works in a bit more detail. So if there are some people here that are not planning to implement version control, and you can still achieve continuous integration, potentially kind of some type of continuous deployment as well. If you're using a tool like Prodly, you can continually sync the data back from production or back from SIT into your dev and scratch orgs. So this is still possible. It does require a bit more thought of how you are potentially going to package metadata as well as data. For metadata, you would be using, potentially something like Prodly with our metadata diff capability to find the changes and push them back, things that are not inside of those orgs. Maybe you'll use change sets. Maybe you'll use DX with their unlocked packages to do this. But there are a lot of ways to manage metadata as well as data without necessarily using a repository. So an example of this is like simple CI/CD for Salesforce, and this is how you could achieve these benefits without a version control system. You can use your environments as like a simple source of truth. So by doing this, you will likely want to have some type of tool like Prodly in place. And then as long as you're really executing like best in class environment management strategy to keep your orgs clean as well as in sync, you can do a lot of this without a version control system. And a benefit here is that it's easier to execute for non-developers. So there are a lot of ways to accomplish a really good practice of doing this. Of course, best in class will likely be using a version control system, but you can get pretty much all the same benefits without using a version control system. So the next piece of this is like, what does best in class staging environment look like? I was just giving a presentation the other day where someone asked me like, why do I need a staging environment in addition to a UAT environment, and like, what is the difference? So like staging environment is really a copy of production to test your deployment. It's going to allow you to know what is the impact of this package that, or this release that I'm about to push to production before you actually really do that. And of course, you can test this, any time of the day. You can test it at peak business hours if you have a staging environment to understand, is everything going to work just from our normal automated, whatever we're using to push our packages? Is that going to interrupt or disturb anything in production? So by knowing that impact, it's a lot different than UAT. If you're trying to use a single org for UAT as well as staging, UAT, there's going to be a lot of in-flight things going on there, potentially user stories or things that are going to be rejected. And you don't want to be making changes to your release in your staging environment. Because the whole point of the staging environment is to understand the impact of that deployment. If you do the deployment and then change things, you don't really know what may happen when you push that into production. So you want UAT in one org and then like staging as its own separate org to avoid monkeying around with your release. You want to actually use staging to test your release. And if you're doing other user acceptance testing and you have things that need to be rejected and you need to change the release, you basically need to do staging that exercise again. So that's why it's best to have two different environments. How to set up a staging environment, that's kind of what this best practice is about. Like you want to seed this by refreshing from production if you do that, because usually a staging environment, one of the best types of environments to do that in is a full copy. This is one of the strong areas that I'd recommend using a full copy, or at least a sandbox that you have seeded with all of your like important account data. So using something like Prodly to push in all of your accounts and your contacts, opportunities, quotes, things like that you care about, that you want to make sure aren't impacted by a deployment. You can put that into an org and have that set up as your staging environment. So you either want to do a refresh, sync via a backup version, or do maybe like a backwards deployment from prod to have everything that you need inside of this staging environment. You then deploy to this exact replica of production to catch any last minute bugs and errors, as well as to maybe understand what other steps you might need to take that are manual to execute the deployment. If you are using some type of automation to push things over, or even if you're just using things like change sets, sometimes you can't pick up everything inside of a change set. You may need to go update some custom settings or something like that, or change some hard-coded like record IDs inside of things that are part of the configuration. And then of course, after you've deployed this to your staging org, test everything. So use whatever regression testing strategy you have to understand how it will be received in production. I'd say this is an essential part of continuous deployment strategy. This is what you want to be doing to make sure that you're not introducing bugs into production. Which leads us to another poll question. Do you use a staging environment? Heated battle here, 50-50.
Pretty evenly split.
Yeah.
Oh. All right, I'm gonna give it about 10 more seconds just to get the last couple of votes in.
Cool.
All right.
Yeah, and so 60% of people said no, which, from my experience, isn't shocking. A lot of people don't have the time or, some of the money to spend on such a thing, which is why I like, working at Prodly, is we can help people with this type of problem be able to use maybe not a full copy sandbox to have an environment to purposely test their deployments to eliminate any possibilities of extra bugs landing in production when you do a deployment. And I guess a lot of times too, if you're at a smaller organization, you just have a couple of admins, you can know and plan the impact of all the changes. But for larger projects, or if you're working with consultants on something that's coming up where they're doing a lot of work that your team doesn't necessarily know all the impacts and changes, for at least those types of projects, I would recommend trying to create a staging environment for those larger deployments that they may be doing. And another best practice here, this is more tied to the continuous integration piece of this, is that you want to commit as soon as a change is complete. So this kind of goes back, maybe I can hop back a few slides really quick to this idea of like a project repository. So as soon as you're making changes, you want to push those into like a project repository or a branch of where you're working to make sure that those are all picked up and you're not missing anything, or that by the time you get to do the deployment, you have so many things in there that you're not really sure what this big mess is. Understanding incremental changes is really important. And this will allow you to do maybe smaller commits. So you can verify that, a few user stories or one entire feature that you're working on is complete, and, put these into small buckets. So you can push those forward to make sure that they work. And then even if you're working on larger project builds, this will allow you to divvy up the work to do things kind of in parallel. So if you have chunks of work that don't have necessarily dependencies on one another, you can have those ready in a repository or ready in an org, if you're using orgs as your source of truth, to be pushed up the stage when everything else is done. The next piece of this presentation, we'll start talking about testing, and we'll cover these three parts of that. So we'll talk about what to test, we'll talk about where to test, and we'll talk about how to test. So a lot of times when people think of testing in Salesforce, they just think of like the validation testing or the code coverage testing, things like that, that are common in the change methodology that Salesforce gives you with validations and change sets and things like that. But really, there's a few different types of tests that are important. I've talked already about what's all the way here on the right of deployment testing, of the importance of using a staging org. Another big piece here all the way on the left is regression testing, which I think is one of the most overlooked, or something that people just don't have time to do in Salesforce development and Salesforce environment management. And that might be a reason that some people don't even bother to have staging orgs, is they don't even have regression testing strategies. This is to make sure that everything that works and you're happy with in production continues to stay that way. And you want to do this effectively at most of the intermediate steps that you're getting to into production. You don't necessarily need to do regression testing in your individual developer orgs, but when those are being merged into your merge or integration org, you definitely want to do regression testing after you have decided what's in your package in your release. And if not there, then in one of the sandboxes in the middle between integration and production. So maybe you have a UAT org, maybe you have a staging org, maybe you have both of them. You'll want to then push your release into like UAT, do regression testing to make sure that everything works. And then if you're in a UAT org, you also of course want to do unit testing, or user acceptance testing is part of that. But the unit testing is maybe first and foremost done by the developers in their own dev orgs and scratch orgs to make sure that the stuff that they made accomplishes the task. Unit testing is kind of the most common and the thing that I see people actually doing in Salesforce all the time, is that they get a change request to make a new flow or fix a broken flow, and they just make sure that that works, and they don't necessarily look at everything else. So that's where regression testing comes in. But then user acceptance testing is actually, by the definition of that, you need to involve end users in this to make sure that they understand the impacts of the changes, that they're happy with them, that this makes their life better and not worse, which can be a bit of a bear, because you have to pull people out of their day jobs for a little bit to make sure that the changes are good. But you don't want to kind of release trash or things that are going to interfere with your end user's life, because at the end of the day, everyone working as Salesforce administrator or developer, they're serving the user base. It doesn't really matter if you think a feature is cool or not, if no one's going to use it or if it's disruptive. So user acceptance testing is important piece of that as well. And then, of course, deployment testing after all of these other steps are done, and you've come up with a solid package for your release. You want to test the release impact on production. So the next topic here is where to test. You'll do unit testing mostly in your dev and scratch orgs where your developers are working. And then after they're happy with their work, that will be pushed to SIT or systems integration testing org, or maybe people just call this integration, where they're picking up all the different stuff from their dev and scratch orgs. And this is where you'll do kind of a first brush of regression testing potentially to make sure that there's no impacts from the work. You'll then package up everything that passes all your tests and works together and is nice into a UAT type of org, or potentially this is a few other orgs before you actually reach staging, to do regression testing when it lands, and then get unit testing or user acceptance testing with end users, get their feedback, make sure that they give it the thumbs up before you push it. After all this testing is complete and UAT, you'll then finish up your finalized release that's ready to go to staging and test the impact of the deployment before it goes to production. And then of course, like how to test. This is all about building, test plans really. And I don't have a lot of, detailed information here, because it's going to vary from business to business how in-depth your regression testing is. But ultimately, a lot of this ties back to our first session on governance. Your center of excellence is going to be, figuring out, what needs to be tested, and that may come in just coming up with this, testing strategy. So building out the test plan. The test plan is the list of things that you need to do and test to make sure that everything works. And then, of course, that plan is kind of a living document. Or potentially a living piece of code where you're updating test scripts. So as new work items come in, you'll create unit test plans for every one of those to make sure that, hey, we need to build this new flow and we want to make sure that it works. Here's the expected outcome for that. Can you please just make sure that this one change actually works? And then, of course, any components of the test plan that are needed to get thrown back into that step one for your kind of build your test plan. When you have a fully built out test plan from this kind of iterative cycle, you can then, of course, figure out if anything's ripe for automation. So Prodly, we sell a tool for automated regression testing for CPQ. It'll basically make sure that if you're changing stuff in CPQ, that your existing quotes, contracts, renewals all still work after you do a big deployment. There are other tools on the market that can, do things with like click players. Things like Selenium are heavily used in organizations to, make sure that I can click new on an account and then new on an opportunity, and everything flows through as expected. You'll want to have automation for as much of this as you can to be, really considered best in class. It's really difficult to accomplish that a lot of times. And, that's why there are a lot of tools on the market, which leads us to our next poll question. Do you have automated regression testing tools for Salesforce? So far, a quick resounding no. We'll see if anyone else wants to throw in here. Yeah, I'm not surprised. And I feel like this is maybe something Salesforce will be looking to build into the platform a bit more. They kind of do this, of course, with like code coverage, where it will test the validation of everything, but not surprised that no one has anything here. So best in class, kind of talked about this before, but this is what it looks like for testing. Center of excellence will drive what must be tested by creating unit test plans. Those are, of course, folded into the regression test plan. So you'll update that as part of each release. You'll have detailed documentation of what needs to be tested manually versus anything that's automated. And it seems like in this case, it's just going to be all, or for this class where no one has a testing tool, that it's all going to be manual tests. And you want to, automate as much of your regression testing as possible, but understand that that can be very difficult. And I think that's about it. This is our last session. We had our previous courses here. There's a link that you can go and access those. And I'm available for change management audits. So if you want to get specific feedback on what you're doing inside of Salesforce, you can talk to me for a little while. Tell me where you're at, tell me where you want to go, and I can help you plan a path to get there. So you can talk to Shannon about that. If there are any questions really about any of the topics in the last courses, I recognize a lot of names from the other courses. Feel free to raise your hand and we can talk through that. But we're pretty much done for the day.
Yeah, like Derek said, if there's anything you want to know about the last, all of the topics we covered, really, don't hesitate to either raise your hands or ask us in the question box. If not, if nothing pops up right now, but you think of something later, don't hesitate to reach out to me or to Derek, and we'll be happy to answer any leftover questions. And if that's...
I was going to say, just a quick note too, for the few people here. I just did a presentation 2 days ago around Salesforce DevOps Center, which I think we can also potentially share. You'll find on our website that talks about how Salesforce is making some improvements to help you use version control and do some more things in change management that are not just change sets, which, if you're curious about these topics, I would highly recommend checking out that webinar that we did with Salesforce Ben. So sorry to interrupt you, Sina. I'm done now.
That's a good suggestion. I'll make sure that everybody here gets a link to a copy of the Salesforce Ben webinar you did this week. But I think if that's it for today, that's let you out of class a little early, and hope you have a good day.
All right, goodbye, everyone.
All right, thank you guys.